Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to this Geneva Network webinar, one in a series of webinars on the issue of trade and the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly as it relates to access to vaccines and other medical products. Today, the subject is the role of open trade in facilitating manufacturing and distribution of COVID vaccines. WTO members are gathering soon in Geneva for their 12th Ministerial Conference, and there's much progress to celebrate in developing and delivering COVID vaccines. But many tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers are delaying vaccine equity, from import duties to export restrictions. And collectively, these trade barriers disrupt globally dispersed manufacturing supply chains and lead to shortages and delays. And meanwhile, barriers to the broader at the border, at customs, are leading to further delays in vital vaccine shipments, especially to developing countries. We're delighted to gather together this panel of experts to shed some light on this issue and discuss the role of the World Trade Organization and other institutions in working towards freeing up some of the trade barriers that are standing in the way to achieving vaccine equity, and looking at some practical solutions that can be undertaken by the international community. So we're pleased to welcome Professor Simon Evenett, who's a professor of economics at the University of St.Gallen in Switzerland and founder of the Global Trade Alert. Fredrik Erixon is the founder of the European Centre for International Political Economy and has been writing widely on trade and globalization issues for many years. Finally, we have Douglas Lippoldt, who's a non-resident senior fellow at Canada's Centre for International Governance Innovation, and is the former chief trade economist at HSBC Global Research and a long-time official at the OECD in Paris. So the panel will proceed as follows. We're going to have a discussion in the first half about the importance of trade barriers in distribution of COVID vaccines and how they impact both manufacturing and distribution. In the second half, we will look at some practical solutions, including the role of the WTO and other institutions in resolving this issue. As always, questions are welcome from the audience, or if you have any comments, short comments you'd like me to read out, please do send them through in the chat box, and I'll endeavour to get to them before the end. We hope to hear from you. So let's kick off. I'll start with the basic question to address to Simon Evenett. Why, when we're looking at COVID vaccine manufacturing in particular, why is global trade important?
So with respect to manufacturing, we have to remember that there's the manufacturing stage for vaccines, and then there's the stage where the vaccines are prepared for distribution, fill and finish, and then they're finally distributed. So you've got 3 steps from the factory into people's arms. Furthermore, you have several companies which make the capital equipment which manufacturers use, as well as the ingredients used in vaccines. All of those producers are not necessarily located in the same country. In fact, to be frank, they're not. They're spread all over the world. And so we need to be able to ship those ingredients, pieces of capital equipment to the factories. The factories have got to ship the bulk vaccines to the fill and finish facilities, and then they've got to ship them to the final point for distribution. And lots of that stuff crosses borders, and every time it crosses a border, it implicates trade policy, and that's exactly why this topic of vaccine production and distribution is so intricately linked to trade policy.
Thank you, and to Fredrik Erixon, Europe, alongside the US, has emerged as quite a major manufacturing centre for these vaccines. What is it about the European trade policy that's allowed? Is there any link between European trade policy and Europe's emergence as a major manufacturing centre? And are there potentially other lessons for other parts of the world?
Yes, I think there is such a link there. Mind you, I mean, if you look at the development of the pharmaceutical industry throughout history, you will of course notice that many of them were born in Europe. They have a European passport, so to speak. And I think as a consequence of that, you will find that many countries have taken policy stances when it comes to all issues around the development, the manufacturing, and the distribution of pharmaceuticals that tend to be pretty free trade oriented, meaning sort of that many EU countries, the European Union itself has for a long time been sort of fairly strong champion for the idea that we should reduce applied tariffs on ingredients as well as finished pharmaceutical products. They were behind an agreement in the GATT, sort of what is called sort of the pharmaceutical agreement, where you had sort of a group of countries that agreed to take away tariffs on pharmaceutical products, and quite often also on some of the core ingredients into it. So I think that's both sort of the commercial history, the corporate history, and trade policy itself has helped to make Europe a big manufacturer of pharmaceutical products. Then, of course, we have seen huge changes happen to the pharmaceuticals industry in Europe over many, many decades. And that has also led to different policy stances on trade policy, not all of whom are going to be pretty helpful in order to support trade. I think sort of one of the remaining issues, which is problematic for the EU, is that it maintains some of the tariffs and some of the trade restrictions on active pharmaceutical ingredients. So we're not applying a zero tariff policy across the board there. There is now talk in Brussels about strategic vulnerabilities, and the Commission has done an analysis where it included some APIs imported, especially from China, but a few other countries as well. And they are saying sort of that Europe has too much dependence on the supply of APIs from some countries, and they want to develop policies to address that. So I think the expectation here is that we're going to see a clearer footprint of European governments on the entire trade policy that cover the supply chain of pharmaceutical products in the future. And of course, that includes vaccines.
Thank you. And a question to Doug. So I think Fred and Simon have touched on the distribution or trading of physical inputs into vaccine manufacturing between borders. Vital, obviously, for products that have multiple components, often made in different countries or sourced from different countries. But what about the intellectual property behind or the know-how of manufacturing a vaccine? How does trade policy allow that knowledge or allow these quite complex components to be shared or traded across borders? Does the IP framework play a role there? And also rules governing digital trade. So there's probably quite a lot of data that's required to pass between different collaborators within a supply chain. How do digital trade rules impact that as well? Sorry, two questions, but if you could touch quickly on that topic.
Certainly, to me, the intellectual property framework is actually, with the advent of the WTO, we had a significant upgrading in the global framework, in particular of concern with, for the sake of pharmaceutical production, was patent protection and the introduction of global rules on trade secrets protection as well. And that intellectual property protection enabled businesses in the pharmaceutical sector that have invested heavily in innovative products to be able to fragment their production, to identify trusted partners globally based on comparative advantage or distributional issues, logistical concerns, and to work with trusted partners in a market-mediated way to license third parties to produce pharmaceutical products or to transfer intellectual property to other sites outside of their home country in a way where they would still be able to earn a return on the innovation that they'd invested heavily in at the outset. Now, there's been some other factors weighing in on this, driving the whole base erosion, profit shifting challenge, where there's been some reassignment of IP rights. But the point is, we've had fragmentation of production. It's led to greater efficiency, cost savings in the sector. It's enabled a faster diffusion of technological innovation in the pharmaceutical sector in a way that's benefited populations around the world globally. On digital trade, the regime is still shaping up, actually, and regional trade agreements have been leading the way rather than the World Trade Organization, to the extent that they've digital trade facilitation has been enabled by agreements such as the CPTPP in the Pacific Basin, or the European Single Market, or the USMCA agreement in North America, or the US-Japan. There's many of these regional accords where framework has been identified for protecting personal information, requiring cybersecurity. It's still a work in progress, but in the medical innovation area, this identification, this tracking of performance of drugs has required building massive databases and being able to share that information across borders. If you look at the 7 COVID vaccines that have been authorized by the WTO, most of them have involved international cooperative efforts, and that's required by definition, this sharing of information across border in a secure manner. So this free flow of data is indeed an important element in this mix. And I think it's also shaped to some extent the types of collaboration. If you look, much of the collaboration has functioned between Europe and the United States. And that's been enabled by a patchwork, fragmented patchwork of legal arrangements that's enabled the transfer to take place.
So an open trading system, both governing physical inputs and digital trade, I think we conclude is fairly essential to manufacturing of and development of COVID vaccines. So turning to the finished product, obviously there's, I gather that manufacturing has scaled up to a pretty high level right now. And by early next year, I think there'll be probably getting close to sufficient doses. Problem being they're not all available throughout the world where they're needed. So my question to Simon is, perhaps you could delineate why trade is important to COVID vaccine distribution. Why are open markets crucial to making the shots get to the right people who need them in various different countries?
So fundamentally, the answer to your question is, of course, this is a global pandemic, and we need to get these vaccines into the arms of people all around the world. And yet production is heavily concentrated in a small number of jurisdictions. So almost by definition, we need to ship the stuff out from the producing nations to the recipient nations. Now, there are several things that can get in the way. First, governments can restrict the amount of exports. Secondly, they can hoard vaccines which they've purchased. They can purchase too much and then hoard them. And thirdly, even if the vaccines get to the importing nation, they could be held up at the border, or worse, they can be admitted into the country, and there isn't the infrastructure to be able to preserve and distribute them. So these are all the different stages with which it can go wrong. Now, I think when you look at the overall scheme of these things, I'm particularly concerned about the hoarding of vaccines by a large number, by the big industrialized countries, where those vaccines are not being shared. There's also some hoarding, I suspect, going on by producers in China and India as well. And I'm a bit worried about the infrastructure to disseminate vaccines in some of lowest income countries. And I don't just mean Africa, there are other countries as well where there are problems too. And I think these are really where the issues are at the moment. Now, just to put this in context for you're quite right to say, Philip, the production scale, we've now produced, or rather the world has produced 8.6 billion doses, and forecasts are by the end of the year we'll have 12 billion. Now this was enough to essentially give every adult a shot who needed one, or needed actually two, and to do so at a level which is likely to lead to the pandemic going into retreat, so around 60 to 70% of the population. So in many ways, the production scale up has been impressive and it will do the job. The real question is distributing these vaccines and getting them into people's arms. And as I said, we have a hoarding problem, and we also have a distribution problem.
Okay, point taken. Fredrik, maybe I can ask you to jump in on that. What's your perspective on, the role of trade in getting these vaccines out to the countries that need them in an equitable and timely fashion?
No, I think Simon touches upon the right issues here, which is that when you look at the forecasted production of finished vaccine doses in the world, I think we are at the point where there are important issues that needs to be discussed still around production incentives, especially if we start to take more of a longer term view to try to understand what the demands for jabs are going to be for sort of several years going on, with especially booster jabs. But the problem right now, when it comes to more of an equitable distribution, is about trying to find a faster way of taking what is being produced into countries where a very small part of the populations have been vaccinated so far, and that is a distribution issue. It's not a production issue. And I think Simon is right that hoarding is an issue. I think also we have infrastructural issues, especially with certain type of vaccines in certain type of countries where the cost of actually distributing these vaccines are pretty high. Looking a little bit sort of down the line, I mean, what I would say is basically sort of regardless if we're talking about a production issue or distribution issue, trade is going to play an extraordinarily important role for all stages of our continued efforts to use our medical expertise in order to reduce the consequences of COVID. And that means we still need to maintain a couple of solid institutions and have a good institutional framework to deal with these issues, where we have a price system that will incentivize producers to continue to develop and continue to produce, also to continue to scale up production, because there will be some necessary scale-ups to be done. We need to have more investment in the capabilities of countries of actually using the existing vaccines to inoculate people that should have the vaccines. And that's also going to be sort of, there will be trade consequences or trade aspects of that issue as well. And of course, that adds to also Dog's point around the intellectual property framework around these issues, which is that if we start to mess too much with the intellectual property framework, that is going to have consequences for both production and distribution of the vaccines in the future as well. So I think my point would be sort of, building on Simon's point, which is that be really careful about what incentives and what institutional frameworks that we should have in the future.
Thank you. And just to bring Doug in, one of the under-remarked roadblocks or barriers or bottlenecks has been the availability of shipping, which we're seeing in all kinds of consumer products in our supermarkets and so forth. Do you have any perspectives on global transport infrastructure, and if it's a problem at the moment that's contributing towards lack of access to vaccines in certain countries?
Well, yes, of course. I think if you've got To me, we have to look at this from a system perspective to start from. I mean, we've got innovative. There was not a COVID vaccine at the start of all this, and we've had seven successful collaborations between businesses that have drawn, I guess, okay, let me reframe. If we've got 7 drugs that have gone from 0 to having a shot in the arm approved by the WHO in short order, this is a remarkable achievement. It's been attained in part through public-private partnerships that have, where there's been state investment in some cases, in the US or in Europe or elsewhere, in many of the antecedents that laid the groundwork, the foundation for this innovation to be achieved. Now rolling out the production, we've got fragmentation of production with contributors to the supply chain at over 100 locations around the world. Chad Bown and a collaborator from the CFR, Chad Bown from the Peterson Institute, collaborator from CFR, Bolicki, have produced a very nice map of this supply chain operation, citing over 100 sites around the world, connected by air freight and by sea freight. I think what we're seeing here, in part, is congestion arriving in the transportation system that's caused delays. Sea freight has played a role, air freight has played a role in this. And we've seen some response. In the Pacific Basin, New Zealand has led an initiative. There was a joint ministerial statement that they championed together with Singapore that drew in several Pacific Basin countries, including China and Canada, among others, seeking to maintain operation of not just the air and sea routes along the main corridors, but also the network in the Pacific Basin region, because this was proving to be essential for the distribution of the various components in the supply chain. We had issues such as the crews being unable to move because of restrictions in personnel movement early on in the pandemic. And I think this is an issue that's still being addressed. We still have congestion. I personally have suffered from this, having just moved from London to LA, a process which took more than 5 months. So yes, transportation is important. It's one element of this. The EU early on in 2020, the first half of 2020, had to take a number of measures to assure openness because parties to the single market in Europe were beginning to put up barriers, and we had we had green lanes installed to ensure that COVID supplies could get across, free movement of personnel. We had guidance on this coming from the European Commission in March of 2020, standards for medical devices to cross border, et cetera. They had to take a number of measures, even in the European Union, to address these problems, to maintain that connectivity. So it's a rambling answer, but the essential bit is that you've got this production that has, to me, it's quite a remarkable achievement that you've gone from, if you look at Moderna, which partnered with the US government, National Institute of Health, to pioneer the development of a novel vaccine with the company itself only owning one site in Massachusetts where they were producing product for clinical trials, and then identifying a Swiss partner, Lonza, to roll out production globally, transferring intellectual property, not only the patent information, but also trade secrets related to the production of a novel mRNA production process to a partner in Switzerland, rolling this out globally, drawing on antecedents, lipid production from a number of third-party producers, everything from the chemical inputs to the glass vials that are used at the end to bottle it, and then getting this out globally. Clearly, transportation of people, data, and physical product are playing a critical role in this, to the point where you're now seeing production of hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine and their administration.
Thank you, Doug. So shipping is obviously an under-remarked problem, and thanks for expanding on that. Turning to Simon, through your global trade alert, you track instances of governments applying various tariff and non-tariff measures. And I know you've been looking carefully at trade in COVID vaccines and other medical technologies. What's your take on what the main specific barriers or tariff and non-tariff measures are at the moment, and who are the kind of countries that are engaging in these? And have they risen and fallen? Are they getting worse, or what's your perspective?
So let me start with the import policies. With respect to tariffs on vaccines, before the pandemic, there were 15 countries which taxed the importation of vaccines by between 1% and 10%. One of the two countries which taxed at 10% was India, and it's my understanding they've actually suspended those tariffs, which is a move in the right direction.
Is that a temporary suspension or permanent?
Well, we don't know if it helped. We don't know how long it will last for. So in principle, it could be temporary for sure. So we've seen on the import tariff side, I mean, it's a very concentrated problem in probably 14 countries at most. When it comes to export restraints, of course, as I said earlier, the production of vaccines is so concentrated that it only takes a small number of countries to put in place export restraints for there to be a serious problem. And we have different types of export curbs or policies in place. We have perhaps at the most moderate end a authorization scheme done by the European Union, and they are authorizing quite a lot of exports of vaccines as we're going forward. But still, when that was first brought out, it was not clear it would be implemented in the way it has. We have countries like India, which have very quietly and below the radar screen banned exports, and then are now slowly allowing exports of vaccines to pick up again. And then we have countries like the United States and the United Kingdom who have used their government procurement rules and the like essentially to forbid the exportation of vaccines. And again, a lot of that's been done below the radar screen. So those are the impediments which we see on the trade policy front. On top of this, you have to add whether there's any trade facilitation or customs importation problems in countries which unfortunately haven't been able to invest in the infrastructure to get products cleared quickly through customs. And of course, with respect to a vaccine, which perhaps is being frozen at or kept at a very, very low temperature, you really do need to clear them pretty quickly. And so you have to add that on top of it. But these were sort of long-standing trade facilitation problems, which have unfortunately have a very high human price at the moment. So I think that's the overall picture, at least as it relates to final vaccines.
What about the regional breakup? What's your data showing? Is the problem better or worse in different parts of the world?
Well, on the import barrier side, I would say you would have to be concerned about developments in sub-Saharan Africa and maybe in some of the least developed countries. So that's where one would have the biggest concerns. In terms of export curbs, as I said, it's really concentrated in the producers, which is US, UK, European Union, and India.
Okay. And the tariffs?
The tariffs, as I said, the import tariffs are very small. I think only 14 countries have them now. So this is less of a problem. Hopefully, it'll be a problem which we can abolish. I mean, no one should be taxing imports of vaccines at this time. It's nuts. Yeah,
I think we can all get behind that. Fredrik, I know eSight, your organization, has written quite a lot on pharmaceutical tariffs in the past. And I note from various studies that they've been falling or being abolished for many years, as Simon's kind of alluded to. But some countries, as Simon's mentioned, still levied the high import tariffs on vaccines. Why are tariffs a problem? Other than the sort of the price that the user pays, which in the case of vaccines is probably less of an issue because governments are paying for them. But is there a price amplification effect of tariffs? And do tariffs delay vaccines getting into the hands of people who need them?
I mean, in principle, yes. I mean, I don't know for the sort of the specific situations of the countries that now have tariffs on COVID-19 vaccine and what the effects they've had on the speed of getting the vaccines into the arms of people. Generally, I mean, I think in my view, sort of one of the important points here is that when you look throughout the entire sector, and you try to figure out, so why are some countries maintaining tariffs on not just vaccines, but on pharmaceutical products more generally? You will see that while it may be a revenue enhancing instrument for some countries, the bigger countries that have been involved in it have also done it in order to protect domestic industry. And I think that's problematic in the first place, because that will have dynamic consequences, especially if you have large economies that are protecting domestic industries. In the past, I think India and Brazil have been the two major problems here. Brazil is now becoming less of a problem, but India certainly still one of those countries that have sort of production capabilities to become a far more influential partner in the entire supply and value chain of pharmaceutical products in the world, but where tariffs are still one of the problems for other countries for other firms to have tighter economic integrations with India in the production of different vaccines. And generally speaking, now India has evolved to a point where it doesn't need to have these tariffs there anymore in order to protect domestic industry. They have much more sort of upside opportunities than downside risks of taking away these particular tariffs. So if we look at sort of some of the broader systemic dynamic consequences that may arise from the use of tariffs in pharmaceutical products, I think that's where I would put my focus, looking at some of the larger emerging markets in the world and trying to understand the benefits that would come from a systemic point of view if they open up more, because that would allow for more fragmentation and more trade in the pharmaceutical production system more generally.
Great, thanks, Fredrik. Okay, so we're over the halfway point. We've discussed and we've outlined some of the trade barriers and trade issues that are impacting the manufacturing and supply of COVID vaccines. Let's talk about some of the policy proposals that are circulating and out there in the wild, whether they're heading in the right direction or whether there's anything you guys can suggest to speed things along a bit. Let's turn to Simon, obviously based in Switzerland, so close to the multilateral coalface. As you know, I think most people know, there's a lot of proposals that are being circulated at the WTO in particular to strengthen health policy. There's the Ottawa Group proposal. The EU put a communique to the WTO in June, and I gather that there's a current communication to the WTO from 31 countries, including lots of developed countries, but also Brazil and China. And Simon, in your view, do any of these initiatives have merit? Is there any one that members of the WTO should be rallying behind, or is there another way?
So in a nutshell, I quite like the proposal from the 31 different WTO members that someone shared in the chat. And I think that this proposal, which was put out towards the end of last month, pretty much draws together a lot of different ideas. It represents it could represent a consensus position if the United States came on board, and it's probably a good place to start. It is certainly so for the audience, this is a proposal which encourages countries to think twice before they restrict exports of medical goods and vaccines. It encourages countries to get rid of their tariffs on medical goods and vaccines. It also encourages greater transparency of government policy, and also supporting trade facilitation efforts largely in developing countries. So there's a lot in here which is good. Now that I should say that proposal, however, could have gone much further. We could have developed a new set of obligations or rules on when countries use export curbs in crises. We could have also made give consideration to making these tariff reductions on medical goods and pharmaceuticals and the like permanent. All of those things were too ambitious for the current WTO membership. But one thing which they could have done, and I still think they can do, is the following. We have about 141 export controls on medical goods, which are still in force today. Of those, about 40 or so will expire in the 6 months after the next ministerial conference. That means there's a large number of these measures which are not temporary. They are borderline permanent. And a simple thing countries could have done would have been to put a date on the expiration of these export curbs. Just say that you're going to announce an expiration date 6 months after the ministerial conference. Doesn't stop you from reimposing them later, but let's work on a basic principle that temporary means temporary. And I would have gone that little extra step. And I think if countries could still do it, governments could still do it. And if they did, they could actually go into this ministerial conference saying that they've done something, not that they're promising to do something, they've actually done something. So I hope that possibility is given some attention in Geneva.
Thanks, Simon. Doug, do you have anything to add on that? What do you think of the proposals that are before the WTO? Do they go far enough or not far enough, as Simon's been arguing?
Well, I think we have the Wto Pharmaceutical Agreement. Right, we've got 34 members that are participating in this. It dates back to the inception of the WTO, providing duty-free treatment for medical products. It seems to me there was an idea which I had heard at one point from the Deutsche Industrie- und Handelskammer, saying that why not expand the coverage of this from pharmaceutical products to also take into account some of the complementary products that are required to administer the vaccines, things such as the syringes or the personal protective equipment that goes along with this. And if you look at the duty rates on the complementary types of medical products that go with the pharmaceuticals or vaccines in particular, duty rates are higher. They can be 5%, 6%, something in that range. Personal protective equipment, you've got duty rates of 11 or 12% on average. It seems to me like there's scope there they could have updated this plurilateral to seek new members, to expand the coverage geographically, but then also to expand the product coverage in a manner. We had this with the Information Technology Agreement, where we updated it in a meaningful way to cover 201 new and emergent electronic products recently. And it seems to me the pharmaceutical agreement could have been right for this type of renewal. And if you get a critical mass, we have most of Europe, North America, Japan participating in this agreement. If we could have expanded to draw on board some of the leading emerging markets as well, I think that could be an interesting building block especially considering something as essential as trade in products affecting all of our health. It seems to me that could have been a constructive step.
Yeah, I'll come back to these coalitions of the willing within the existing WTO framework. I kind of think that a lot of the problems certainly in trade are in the least developed countries and certain developing countries who are not party to particularly the WTO Pharmaceutical Agreement. So maybe trying to get a multilateral whole WTO deal would be better because it would include those countries. But maybe Fredrik, you'd like to comment on the proposals, building on what Simon and Doug have said. Do you think the members are putting the right kind of things in front of the World Trade Organization, or is there, as Simon has hinted, more to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of countries are trying to be a little bit more realistic about what's possible to achieve, and also what's possible to achieve, not 10 years from now, but what is possible to achieve, if not this year, so at least in the next couple of years. I think it was Simon who referred to sort of a compromise type document that was issued a few weeks ago, where I can't remember, but I think it was 30 plus countries that made a proposal for what type of issues that they could rally around ahead of the Ministerial Council. I mean, there were two notable non-signatories to that agreement, which was India and South Africa, those who have done sort of the most of the campaigning in order to try to take the focus away from these issues and focus much more on issues of waiving certain parts of the TRIPS agreement in order to make this issue more of an intellectual property issue rather than more of an economic issue. Whatever we do, and you said you wanted to come back to coalitions of the willing and other forms of collaboration later, but I think this goes to the heart of the agenda itself. Given the wide differences that exist between countries and how they approach these issues, you will have to work with what's possible to do, and that's going to be smaller forms of agreements between coalition countries. And if you do that, you can certainly expand on what you've already laid out in that sort of October compromise document. Simon pointed to, you can do a lot more to try to clear up rules for export restrictions. You don't need to do that necessarily by reforming existing GATT agreement. You can have this much more sort of as a docking device for countries where they can commit to different behavioral rules if this is going to happen in the future. I think you could include issues like technical standards for medical products to go into it as well. I mean, notably, many countries waived many of these technical standards during the height of the first and second wave of the pandemic, and then they took them back, or they decided to maintain sort of the new type of openness that they had. And I think the lesson learned is that many countries have gone and become far too bureaucratic when it comes to the technical standards and the sort of the entire trade ministry framework for importing different medical products. That's not an issue perhaps for vaccines more specifically, but it concerns medical products much more generally. And I think there are huge benefits here if we can get countries to engage also in some sort of a commitment mechanism plurilaterally, where countries come forward with different ideas and different proposals they have for how they can help to maintain more openness in the future.
So there's a kind of agreement between you and Doug on the need to, or the efficiency of building on existing smaller agreements amongst like-minded member states. Simon, where do you stand on this? Do you think we should be pitching for a whole WTO agreement, or do you think there's merit in building on what's already there in terms of plurilaterals, the trade facilitation agreement, for example, or the pharmaceutical agreement?
I think there's two things. There's two dimensions to this, right? One is, what do you want to see done before the next ministerial conference, and then what could be done after that? And then I think there's a real distinction between the sort of importing side and the exporting side of this. So in terms of what we can do before MC12, what you have with this 31 nation document plus Ambassador Walker's most recent text is probably what we're going to get. I mean, I don't think there will be much more than that. You would hope after this pandemic was over, there'll be some reflection on can we do better. And then I think then this second part of your question really kicks in, because if you think the problem you really want to tackle is trade facilitation, especially getting vaccines fast and safely into countries, then we already have a trade facilitation vehicle which we can build on. So I would strongly endorse that. And I think we would have to combine that, any initiative there, with aid for trade, which would help developing countries which need support to improve their import processing procedures. So I think on the import side, there's clearly a vehicle we can build on. On the export curb side, quite frankly, I mean, this is because production is so concentrated at the moment in a small number of countries, whether you're talking about vaccines or many other types of medical equipment, we don't really need a small group agreement. Comes pretty close to being a multilateral agreement. So there's less of a distinction, I think, on the export curb side than on the import side. But let's be clear, that doesn't make it necessarily much easier, because governments appear to have been very reluctant to contemplate any curb on the use of their export controls. So that would be, I think, a pretty hard negotiation, but one which would be worth at least exploring whether there's interest in doing it, precisely because we've seen how counterproductive export controls were last year at the beginning of the crisis, especially with respect to PPE and medical equipment. So maybe my answer is it's staged and it's differentiated between import policy and export policy.
Thank you. And then Doug, stepping outside the WTO, putting that to one side, given that WTO deals are notoriously difficult to negotiate, why not jump on the back of existing bilateral or sort of regional trade agreements that are already in place, the CTPP being an obvious example? Wouldn't that be a faster and quicker way, or do you think we should stick with the WTO, the multilateral framework?
Well, as a trade economist, I would prefer to see a global, a system that promotes global openness and a standard rule book that reduces asymmetries and maintains the maximum extent of openness that's feasible. But that's a very difficult space to operate in, to get consensus among 164 members of the WTO. So as I've hinted at before, I feel like these coalitions are the willing, where you do have an ability to move beyond that, to build on the WTO base and go further. As these agreements as they achieve scale, they attract additional adherents. CPTPP now has China expressing interest in joining, or Colombia or Thailand, and so this there's a demonstration effect here. And as innovations appear in these regional agreements, they attract where they're successful. They attract the interest of others, and eventually you can get to a stage where you're able to multilateralize an innovation. This is happening now, I think, in digital trade with respect to e-commerce. Hopefully at MC12, we'll see some of these fragmented regional rules that have worked and been replicated now among several multiple partners. Maybe some of these will now be generalized in an e-commerce agreement at the WTO in the coming, well, I hate to speculate, but year or two. I guess one thing that really strikes me here, I think, is that there's a very important component here that goes beyond trade, and that is investment. And as Simon and his team at Global Trade Alert did a very interesting report on this, the GTA 27 from last June report, highlights this. my point is that there's things that developing countries can do to improve the conditions for doing business within their borders. And it's not just about the World Bank doing business indicators, which are actually not a bad place to start, but facilitating inward foreign direct investment. And what I'm getting at is, I think beyond market openness, there needs to be a greater diffusion of technology around the world for the production of pharmaceutical products. And in particular, now we're seeing the rollout of COVID vaccine production. And this is a way of promoting greater equity in the distribution of medical products in a market-mediated way, so that if countries are able to provide an environment conducive, we've seen from the pharmaceutical, innovative pharmaceutical firms, a willingness to partner, to work with contract manufacturers in countries around the world, with partners, trusted partners. So if emerging markets and middle-income countries are able to create a more hospitable environment for inward FDI, I think we'll see greater, and that includes not just the reduction of tariffs, but the types of trade facilitation that Simon was talking about, reducing the investment screening impediments to inward FDI, assuring a protection, adequate protection for intellectual property rights. I think there's a part of the answer here for countries that have seen delays in accessing COVID vaccines and other medical products, to engage in some self-help here, creating an environment that's welcoming this type of production within their own borders, and that has potential to improve the resilience of the entire production network, right? If you have a site that's been taken offline because of the outbreak of COVID and workers, unable to staff a factory in one region, if you have this global network, you have a better probability that the network, the production network of a vaccine producer will remain robust, will survive. So there's a win-win scenario here that is trade plus, that takes into account this investment facilitation, and creates an environment that's more conducive to a robust, resilient system.
Thanks, Doug. We've got 5 minutes left. So I want to put this to Fredrik, building on what Doug was talking about, the need to kind of disperse COVID vaccine manufacturing a bit more globally. Do you think the WTO waiver, that's an IP waiver that's under discussion, is a suitable vehicle for achieving that? Or do you think there are other ways of achieving that?
So I don't think waiving TRIPS or specific provisions in TRIPS are going to do a lot to providing more production capacity at a faster pace than we're seeing right now. There may be a couple of examples of it where it could happen, but the general sort of context right now is that most firms have struggled quite a lot in order to scale up production as fast as possible, and they've done it through different type of means, not just investing in own production capacities, but contracting with competitors, licensing their IP, and sharing know-how and many other trade secret aspects with other companies. What we want to do is basically make sure that there are incentives for them to continue to do this. And ideally, that would be sort of combined with a general policy orientation of the kind that Doug talked about, which is that you have an increasing appetite on the part of many countries to become a lot more welcoming to investments that will be made by some of these companies to establish production facilities in parts of the world where they aren't existing right now. But we have to acknowledge at the same time that countries that are constantly pushing for waiving IP rights, they create sort of a problem for themselves, in the sense that it's an indication to many companies that we may not be talking about a country which will be able to provide the type of institutional protection that is needed in order to make these investments. And I think in this sense, many of those countries that are now campaigning the loudest for waiving these IP rights, they create sort of long-term problems for themselves rather than create opportunities for them. So in order to make the situation on the ground a lot better, I don't think it's changes to TRIPS, whether it's temporary waivers or if it's negotiating about clarifying certain provisions on a more permanent basis. I don't think that's going to deliver much. The real work is going to be going to happen on the ground with the expansion of production capacities through a lot of different means in the future. What governments need to do and what they can do in order to help that, and where sort of some of my worries are coming in, is that first of all, the governments that have the financial capacity to establish a broader demand and price framework for not just what's going to happen this year and next year, but more generally for pandemic vaccines, are now beginning to talk with the manufacturers about negotiating prices or changing prices to the extent that to take away a lot of the incentives for these firms to rapidly scale up production. And that is a real issue. And it's a real issue when you have sort of big purchases in Europe that are doing it. It's not just countries with limited financial means, but in this case also pretty affluent governments that are now beginning to have second thoughts about how much they're going to pay for it in the future. And if they start to reduce prices, that's going to have a knock-on effect on the incentives to provide vaccines, especially for those who don't have the financial capacity to pay for it. So the price theory 101 here would basically be that ensure that you have a framework for good market mediated prices, and that these prices provide all the incentives we need right now in order for the scale up to continue and for it to even improve. Thanks, Fred. So we've come to the end now. I think we've got about a minute left to just really sum up. So I'm going to ask each of you just to say in 30 seconds or less, if possible, what your message is for the ministers gathering in Geneva shortly for the conference. Simon, perhaps you'd like to give us your concluding thoughts.
Sure. So vaccine inequity and the inequity in distribution is a first order global problem. The TRIPS waiver is not the solution. What we need to be doing is making sure the production scale up of vaccines continues, that nothing gets in the way of that. And we need to tackle head on the hoarding of vaccines by many Western governments. That's my 2 cents.
Great. And Fredrik?
No, I can just echo what Simon just said. These are the most important parts. Thanks.
And Doug?
I would argue that innovation in pharmaceutical products has been concentrated in just a few countries. That openness in a rules-based multilateral framework is essential for the diffusion of this technology, this innovative, life-saving technology. It's as simple as that. We need to have this openness to enable circulation of the innovation that's been achieved, and it's also an important lesson. COVID's provided an important lesson for responding to the next pandemic, the importance of openness.
Thank you, Doug. We will be watching the ministerial with interest. So it just remains for me to thank our three guests, Doug, Simon, and Fred, for their excellent contributions. Much obliged. This webinar will be available on our website. If you fancy a revisit, it'll be available tomorrow. So please do check in. And thank you to the audience for listening. And we'll see you again at the next Geneva Network webinar. So thank you very much and good afternoon. Goodbye.